The initial stake pool offering model is evolving extremely quickly inside the Cardano ecosystem. And that's going to require that we discuss the risk avoidance spectrum, not just for users, but also for operators. Ready? Let's go. We're going to talk about the approaches that different projects are taking to the ISO model because that's changed pretty fundamentally in the last couple months. And we're also going to talk about something we normally don't talk about, a little bit of drama. But we're not going to get bogged down in the details or take a side or become involved in it. We're just going to make sure that we're all aware it exists and talk about it at a very high level. As a starting point, let's be clear that you're always somewhere on the risk avoidance spectrum in crypto. Going back to the very beginnings of Bitcoin, Satoshi was taking a gigantic chance by releasing the Bitcoin white paper and then kicking off Bitcoin. Because in most of the Western world, it's pretty illegal to start your own currency. Satoshi mitigated these dangers by maintaining complete anonymity as far as we know. He was communicating with people who would later be involved and are kind of still involved in the crypto community. But Satoshi pretty much maintained complete anonymity. People have guesses as to who Satoshi is, and this has been a fun game throughout the history of cryptocurrency. Everybody in Cardano probably knows that Charles's prime suspect for Satoshi is Adam Back. There were also rumors that John McAfee somehow determined that it was Adam Back. I don't know who Satoshi is. I don't think anybody really does. And it probably doesn't matter. But the point is, Satoshi knew he was pretty far out on the risk spectrum, pretty far in the direction where regulators might come knocking on his door and potentially he could be prosecuted and placed in prison. The same has always been true pretty much with all blockchain projects. You're somewhere on this risk spectrum from very, very safe. In the Cardano context, we might say that, buying ADA, being a user of ADA, buying ADA. Let's say that's on the very, very safe end of the Cardano, regulatory risk avoidance spectrum. On the other end is, there are certain very criminal things you could do involving fraud and theft, things like that. But as far as normal things, not involving straight crime, or we could say not involving the kinds of crime that are very easy to recognize, you could say there's other degrees of high regulatory risk. Probably chief among these is engaging in a securities offering that doesn't involve registration with the SEC or exemption. We've covered that ad nauseum on this channel. We won't get into exactly what that means in this video. We have many times in previous videos. But we can say that's pretty far out on the risk spectrum. And when you have an initial stake pool offering, that is one of the things that's got to be on the table. It's got to be on your radar. Are we engaging in some securities law, securities regulation violations? The big problem with law is that when you are talking about innovative new things, innovative technologies, you often end up in this area of legal and regulatory ambiguity. You end up in this gray area. And that's kind of where the initial stake pool offering concept is right now. I think it's fair to say the history of the ISO concept in crypto, it looks like Sundaeswap is definitely the group who, in my mind, sort of like brought this to the public consciousness. I think it was a member of their community who first proposed it to them. I could be wrong about that, but I think Sundaeswap is the one who made us all first start thinking about this, regardless of who came up with the concept. I'm sure 50 different people are going to claim that they initially invented this idea, but they were the ones, Sundaeswap were the ones who first made us all think about this. They talked about it the most. But I think they also did the right thing. I think Sundaeswap realized, hey, this is a brand new thing. It's kind of weird because we're not having consumers and others send their ADA to us in exchange for tokens in our project in a traditional ICO. We're having people delegate to stake pools. At least initially, I believe the idea was they'd have people delegate to stake pools, and then those rewards would go to the project, and then the delegators would receive tokens in the project in exchange. That's my read of the initial idea for the project. But Sundaeswap was smart. They realized that this fell into this ambiguous gray area, and it maybe wasn't, maybe it was going to be okay, maybe not. But it sounds like Sundaeswap has now taken the time to have attorneys research this. And it looks like from this release of the latest details on their initial stake pool offering that they've probably come to the determination that you can't really get around the Howey test. Again, something we've covered quite a bit in previous videos. You can't really get around the Howey test by having sort of stake pool as middleman. The delegation rewards for delegators are the second they're earned, right? That's something that the delegators are sort of entitled to based on the terms of the arrangement between them and the stake pool. If the stake pool says, hey, we're taking, 3 or 4 or 5 or whatever, some percentage of that, we're also taking a fixed fee of 340 ADA per epic, you get the rest of the staking rewards. That's the arrangement. So the second those are earned, the delegators are sort of entitled to those ADA. In the initial presentations of the ISO model, the delegation rewards, instead of going back to the delegator who would normally be entitled to them at that point, they would be going to the project. This is creating this little cutout where it's going through a stake pool. Doesn't really, I believe the conclusion that a project like Sundaeswap is probably coming to is that the stake pool as middleman isn't a sufficient shield to a claim by regulators that this is functionally equivalent to an ICO. And I think a lot of people in the crypto community have come to the conclusion that a lot of the ICOs, and by a lot, I'm saying like 99% of them back in 2017 were unregistered offerings of securities with no exemption, right? They were a violation of the securities regulations or laws, probably. The Cardano ISO was a little bit different because it didn't happen in the West. It happened in Japan, and all of the investors were largely Japanese or from other Asian countries like South Korea. You can say that the Cardano ISO was a little bit different, or ICO, sorry, it was a little bit different. But for every Cardano project these days, they have to decide if they're engaging in capital formation, fundraising. If they're engaging in fundraising, they have to decide, where do we want to be on the risk avoidance spectrum, regulatory risk avoidance spectrum, and is a proposed method of capital formation, is it too far out for us? And it's looking like projects that don't want to be too far out on the regulatory risk avoidance spectrum, the ones that don't want to take that much risk, they're deciding that the ISO model as originally proposed is too risky. Here you can see Sundaeswap is saying, we will collect 0 ADA rewards from the stakers. They are no longer choosing to use the ISO model for capital formation. It's no longer a fundraising model for them. It's just a method for them to distribute Sunday tokens out to the community, to get the community involved in their project. And you can see here, it says, to avoid forcing people to choose between staking in the ISO or participating in the DEX, we've opted to give the ISO a shorter duration to support the long-term success of the DEX. They're saying they're going to distribute 1% of their total supply each epic over a total of 5 epics. So over the course of 25 days, it looks like they're going to distribute, if I'm reading this correctly, 5%. 1% each epic for 5 epics. So 5% over 25 days of the Sunday tokens will be distributed in this ISO. And it looks like the rest of it will be distributed via the DEX. So the ISO is not going to be a fundraising mechanism for them. It's just going to be a way for them to get 5% of their tokens out there to the Cardano community. This is very different than using it for fundraising, because we know one of the prongs of the Howey test is that money is invested. Here, if I'm reading this correctly, it looks like they're just giving you the Sunday tokens. Sure, you have to delegate to certain pools. They're planning on using independent SPOs to run the pools. Looks like they're not going to run the pools, so you'd have to delegate to one of the independent SPOs that's running a pool involved in this distribution. But they're not taking any of the ADA. They're not receiving anything in consideration for this distribution of Sunday tokens. So they've completely opted out of using the ISO as a tool of capital formation. And it looks like they're not the only ones who don't want to be that far out on the regulatory risk avoidance spectrum. Minswap is debuting what they call a fair ISO, or FISO. And from their tweets, it looks like they're saying, we are not raising money from this. They're doing something similar. It says they want to encourage delegation to small stake pools, and it looks like they will be distributing tokens in their project on that basis, but they're not using it. Looks like they're not using it for capital formation as well. It looks like they've also come to this conclusion that a stake pool is not a good shield to assertions that you're violating the securities law when you take ADA in exchange for project tokens. And this makes sense. Again, the delegators would normally earn a certain amount of ADA every epoch, regardless of whether they chose a 1% margin pool, a 5% margin pool, whatever they would earn. The market would reward them with some amount of ADA each epoch for their participation in staking. And here they're trading that value. Whatever that value would end up being, they're trading it for project tokens. In the case of an ISO where the project is actually taking their ADA rewards. You could say that an analog to this might be akin to an employee trading part of their salary each month for securities in some corporation. There's still an exchange of value there. Just because the employee is giving up part of their salary for securities of the corporation doesn't mean there's not an exchange of value for those securities. And I think these projects have figured out that they don't like where initial ideas about ISOs would put them on this regulatory risk avoidance spectrum. As you probably know, not all projects are taking that same approach to ISOs or ISPOs. Here we have adapools.org, and I just searched for Meld, and various different pools in the Meld group pop up. You can see here today, ADA pools is showing us 4 different pools. One of them appears to have 62.9 million in stake. One has 60.49 million. One has 60.16 million. So 3 different pools, pretty close to saturation. One pool with 19.16 million, but the 3 pools that are nearly saturated here all show a fee margin of 99%. So that means the pool is taking almost all of the ADA rewards. And of course, this is because these pools are initial stake pool offerings. The pool that only has 19.16 million is a 50% pool, meaning that it appears the project is taking 50% of the ADA rewards. So this is obviously much further out on the regulatory risk spectrum than the approach being taken by Minswap and Sundaeswap. Meld is just running with the initial idea for an ISO, or in their case, they label it an ISPO. They're getting the staking rewards, and their delegators are getting tokens in their project. So we've got a real live experiment here. We're going to get to see what happens when you do this. Is it going to turn out to have been a good idea? Is Meld going to get off the hook? Will they have no regulatory interactions from from the regulators that projects would fear in this kind of scenario, or will regulators eventually come down on them in some way? We're going to actually get to see what happens. But even if, and to be clear, this is a hypothetical, we don't know what's going to happen. Even if Meld has some disfavorable interactions with regulators over the way this ISO is being handled down the road at some point, this probably won't be the last of the ISO model. The ISO model is super interesting because delegators don't have to risk their principal. They're just risking the staking rewards. I think there's some value in this concept. I don't know if it currently meets. I don't know what regulators are going to do with people executing on the concept right now. But just like there are ways to violate the securities laws, there are ways to comply with the securities laws. We have things like private placements. And there are ways you can do a private placement and comply with the securities laws. It involves a ton of disclosure, like the kind you find in private placement memorandums, commonly called PPMs. And there's other things you have to do to comply to meet exemptions from registration. We've also got full-on registered initial offerings, right? Those do happen. They're costly. There's a lot of compliance, legal, regulatory work that needs to be done to make them happen, but they do happen. I think down the road, we could eventually see the ISO model being used for fully compliant offerings, maybe for private placements that are fully compliant with SEC regs, maybe for full-on registered offerings that are fully compliant with SEC regs. I think we could see something like that because there's some value to this concept. This concept is super interesting. We haven't really had many examples of this scenario where you would be able to participate in something like this and not risk the principal, but just risk your staking rewards, because we haven't really had staking before. Crypto brought us staking. There have been some cognates, some like similar things in the financial world, but staking rewards are kind of brand new. They're kind of a crypto thing. And I think as crypto grows, we could see fully compliant fundraising that maybe involves these initial stake pool offerings. For now, though, this is a live experiment, and we're going to see what happens with Meld based on them executing it right now. It should also be of no surprise that Meld, who are the only ones who are kind of doing the ISO thing on this scale, where they're actually taking the rewards, they've been under the microscope a little bit, and there has been a little bit of drama. The entire Cardano community could see from the near saturation of their multiple pools that the Meld project was on its way to make some serious money. So of course, the microscope was focused on the project, and certain people started doing some digging about the participants in the project. This Twitter account in particular, the one on the screen right here, at BobMe808, Temujinx. I think Temujin, wasn't that the real name of Genghis Khan? I think his name was Temujin. I could be misremembering that, but I think that's his name. This Twitter account made some pretty serious accusations. To be clear, we don't know what's true, what's not true. We're not presenting any of this as fact. I think it's important, though, that people are aware there's a little bit of drama going on, and there are some accusations. And these accusations, a lot of them seem to revolve around the expertise of the Meld team, specifically whether or not they have requisite competence in Haskell. We won't get into the details today, but if you go to this Twitter account, you can read the very many, very strongly worded accusations. But like all things in crypto's not unlike any other small-ish community. A lot of times when this drama happens, it follows the same pattern. Accusations come out. And then a couple of days later, if you're smart, you kind of reserve judgment. You say like, hey, I've seen this before in like sub-communities of various types. Accusations come out, and then you try to reserve judgment, and you say, okay, what usually happens in these cases is whoever is being accused of whatever comes back with a reply. And it always sort of changes your perspective. As someone on the sidelines watching all this go down, you might read the initial accusations. They're usually very inflammatory, and you're like, wow, it seems like there's something going on here. Where there's smoke, there's fire. There must be something here. This doesn't look good at all. A lot of red flags. And then a couple days later, you hear from the person who's being accused of whatever thing, and it you always end up in this position where you're like, okay, this is much more ambiguous than I thought. This is not black and white. There are some things that are unanswered here, and it's not nearly as bad as the accusations made it sound. And in this case, we also got a response from the person who I believe is the head of the tech team at Meld. So if you go to the Meld team page, that seems to be this fellow right here, Hai Nguyen Quang. He's listed as the CEO, and he has a LinkedIn which labels him as an entrepreneur, system architect, and blockchain engineer with associations with various companies in the past. And he's been active on some other social media platforms. This is a Reddit thread about a video that kind of highlighted some of the criticisms of the Meld team. And it looks like Kwong is coming back and he's defending the expertise of his team. He's citing this paper. He says, our engineers have gained Haskell experience through projects like this. And he cites this paper, not just some online courses. The doctor I co-authored that draft with had worked at IOHK before as well. He's saying you can call us C-levels out anytime, but these are the brightest crops from our country who are so hungry they work every Saturday, every Sunday. At the end of the day, we're competing with companies like Cloudflare over those engineers. Our team section on the website is outdated now as well. We're going to update with many more experience profiles soon. In another thread, he mentions, we've been doing technical due diligence with IOHK and they really like the project. But until we are more proven, what else can we expect from them publicly? From Kwong's posts, it sounds like there's going to be more. He's going to come back with more information to defend the legitimacy of his team. But the upshot is, like a lot of projects in the crypto space in general, we don't really know. All we can go on is what we know. And at this point, it's unclear how much experience his team might have in the Haskell space. You can go in and decide for yourself. If you do some quick searches across social media, you'll find tons of posts already about this controversy. And you can decide for yourself. Does it sound like they're an experienced team? Does it sound like they're not? Are they, does it even matter? You can make all those decisions for yourself. The point is, it's a little bit unsurprising that the team that seems to be the furthest out on the regulatory risk avoidance curve is also the team that's kind of falling under the microscope for things like this. Also interesting to note, when we go to the Indigo Protocol team page and we scroll down to the team members, it appears we have the same Hai Nguyen Quang as the core developer. When you click on his LinkedIn, it definitely looks like it's the same guy. I'm kind of wondering if he's going to change his banner here. So it's like half Meld, half Indigo Protocol, or how all that's going to work. If we scroll down, we can see he's listed as an advisor to Indigo Labs and the co-founder and CEO of Meld. It appears there may be more than one Cardano project that has a vested interest in whether or not this individual is able to prove out their expertise. And I will talk to you tomorrow.